The snickers at Precision Point shooting range always started the moment Elena Vasquez's boots crossed the threshold. At 32, she stood barely 5'6" in her worn combat boots, her jet black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed the faint scar running along her left temple. Her shooting jacket was clean but threadbare, her gear functional but far from top of the line. But none of that mattered to the regulars at Riverside County's premier shooting facility. To them, she was just another washed-up veteran whose hands shook too much to hit the broad side of a barn. They had no idea that those same trembling hands would soon accomplish what even the world's steadiest marksmen called impossible, splitting a bullet clean in half on a razor blade at 200 yards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena loaded her rounds with methodical precision, trying to ignore the whispered conversations that followed her like shadows through the indoor facility. The Precision Point range was a temple to marksmanship, with its polished concrete floors, state-of-the-art ventilation system, and dozens of lanes stretching out under brilliant LED lighting. Corporate logos from major ammunition manufacturers decorated the walls, and glass cases displayed championship trophies won by the range's sponsored shooters. This was where serious competitors came to train, where Olympic hopefuls honed their skills, where the wealthy came to play with expensive toys. Elena didn't belong in any of those categories, and everyone knew it. "Look who's back," Tommy Rodriguez called out from lane 12, his voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty disguised as humor that she'd grown accustomed to. At 45, Tommy was the unofficial king of the range's weekend warriors, man who'd never served a day in the military but wore tactical gear like a costume and spoke in military jargon he'd learned from YouTube videos. His custom rifle probably cost more than Elena's monthly disability check, and he never let anyone forget it. "Think your hands are steady enough today, Vasquez? Or should we clear the adjacent lanes for safety?" The laughter that followed was sharp and mean-spirited. Elena's cheeks burned, but she'd learned long ago that reacting only made it worse. She adjusted her protective glasses and focused on her target, a simple bullseye at 50 yards, nothing fancy, nothing that should challenge someone with her background. But as she raised her rifle, the familiar tremor began in her fingers, spreading up through her wrists like electricity. "Jesus, look at that," whispered Maria Santos from the lane to her right. Maria was a local police officer, competent enough with her service weapon, but never someone who'd shown interest in precision shooting until the recent trend made it fashionable among law enforcement. How does she even expect to qualify for anything with hands like that? Elena's grip tightened on the rifle stock, the trembling becoming more pronounced as stress compounded the neurological damage that had ended her military career 3 years ago. Through her scope, the target seemed to dance and weave, the black circles blurring together as her hands betrayed her once again. She took a deep breath, trying to remember the techniques that had once made her the best designated marksman. In the 82nd airborne dot, the shot rang out, echoing through the range despite the sound dampening. Her bullet struck the target's outer ring, not terrible for a casual shooter, but embarrassing for someone who'd once been able to put 5 rounds through the same hole at 300 yards. Elena heard Tommy's exaggerated sigh from across the range. "Painful to watch," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I heard she used to be military." Hard to believe they'd let someone that shaky anywhere near a weapon in combat. Elena's jaw clenched. If Tommy only knew about the medals locked away in her apartment, the commendations for marksmanship excellence, the letter of recommendation from Captain Brooks that called her the finest natural shooter I've encountered in 20 years of service. But those achievements felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone who existed before the IED explosion that changed everything. Sarah Kim, one of the range's younger employees, approached Elena's lane with a concerned expression. At 24, Sarah was studying criminal justice and worked part-time to help pay for school. Unlike the regulars, she'd never shown anything but kindness to Elena, though she'd never quite understood why everyone seemed so cruel to the quiet veteran. "Hey, Elena," Sarah said softly, pretending to check the lane's equipment while speaking in a voice only Elena could hear. "Don't let them get to you. I've seen your targets from the late-night sessions when you think nobody's watching. You're better than any of them know." Elena managed a small smile. Sarah was one of the few people who'd witnessed Elena's after-hours practice sessions, when the range was empty and the pressure was off. During those quiet midnight hours, when her hands were steadier and her mind clearer, Elena could still summon echoes of her former skill. But knowing she could shoot well in private only made the public humiliation more painful. "Thanks," Elena whispered back. "Some days are better than others." "Most days should be better than dealing with these weekend warriors," Sarah replied, glancing meaningfully at Tommy, who was now demonstrating his proper shooting stance to a group of admirers. "Half these guys couldn't qualify for mall security, but they act like they're Navy SEALs." Elena loaded another round, determined to end her session on a better note. The tremor was still there, but she'd learned to work with it rather than against it. She controlled her breathing, found her natural point of aim, and slowly squeezed the trigger. This shot struck closer to center, earning a grudging nod from Sarah. "That's more like it," Sarah said with genuine enthusiasm. But Tommy had been watching too. "Lucky shot," he called out. "Let's see you do that 10 times in a row. Oh wait, we'd be here all day waiting for your hands to stop shaking." The cruelty in his voice cut deeper than usual, perhaps because Elena knew he wasn't entirely wrong. The neurological damage from her injury meant her hands would never be completely steady again. The military doctors had been very clear about that. But what they hadn't understood, what none of these range regulars could comprehend, was that steadiness and accuracy weren't always the same thing. Elena packed her gear methodically, ignoring the continued commentary from Tommy's group. She headed toward the exit. She passed the range's bulletin board, covered with announcements for upcoming competitions, training courses, and equipment sales. One flyer caught her eye: bright red paper with bold black text announcing the Riverside County Precision Shooting Championship, scheduled for next month. First prize, $50,000 and a sponsorship deal with Apex Ammunition, she read quietly. Below that, in smaller text, final challenge will test the ultimate limits of precision marksmanship. Elena stared at the flyer for a long moment, her mind racing. $50,000 would change everything. It would pay off her medical bills, cover her rent for more than a year, maybe even allow her to start the veteran support program she'd been dreaming about. But entering would mean facing Tommy and dozens of other competitors, all of whom would know about her condition, all of whom would expect her to fail spectacularly. Thinking about entering? Sarah had appeared beside her, following Elena's gaze. "To the competition announcement." "Just curious," Elena replied, though something deeper was stirring in her chest, a familiar feeling she hadn't experienced since her military days. It was the sensation of a challenge presenting itself, of an opportunity to prove something important. "You should do it," Sarah said with surprising conviction. "I've seen what you can do when you're in the zone. These guys have no idea." Elena folded the flyer and slipped it into her jacket pocket. As she walked to her car, Tommy's laughter still echoing behind her, she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to enter the championship. She was going to show everyone exactly what those trembling hands were capable of. What Elena didn't know was that the final challenge would involve something no competitor had ever attempted before, something that would either vindicate everything she'd lost or destroy what little confidence she had left. The razor blade was waiting, and so was her chance at redemption. The nightmare always began the same way, with the sound of children laughing in the distance and the smell of burning diesel fuel. Elena would find herself back on the dusty road outside Kandahar, her rifle steady in her hands, watching through her scope as her squad moved through the village market. In the dream, she could still feel the confidence that had once defined her, the absolute certainty that her weapon was an extension of her will, that every shot would find its marked dot. Then came the flash of white light, the earth-shaking explosion. And the moment when everything she'd been trained to be was stripped away in a shower of concrete and shrapnel. Elena jolted awake in her small apartment, her sheets soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air flowing through her open window. 3 years had passed since the incident, but her subconscious refused to let go of that day. She sat on the edge of her bed, holding her hands out in front of her, watching the familiar tremor dance through her fingers like electricity seeking ground. The irony wasn't lost on her. Before the explosion, Elena Vasquez had been what military instructors called a natural, one of those rare soldiers, who seemed born to handle weapons with supernatural precision. At Fort Sterling, where she'd completed her advanced marksmanship training, her instructors had spoken of her in hushed, reverent tones. Staff Sergeant Williams had once told her class that Elena could put a bullet through a wedding ring at 400 yards and leave the marriage intact. Her military service record, now gathering dust in a filing cabinet somewhere, told the story of a remarkable career trajectory. Elena had enlisted straight out of high school in El Paso, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and a desperate need to escape the poverty that had defined her childhood. Basic training had revealed her exceptional hand-eye coordination and spatial awareness. Advanced individual training had honed those natural gifts into something approaching artistry. By her second deployment, Elena had become the 82nd Airborne's go-to designated marksman, the soldier they called when a situation required surgical precision rather than overwhelming firepower. She'd earned 3 Army Commendation Medals for actions under fire, including one incident where she'd neutralized 2 enemy snipers from over 600 yards while under intense rocket fire. Her platoon leader, Captain Brooks, had submitted paperwork recommending her for the Army's elite Sniper School, a recommendation that would have launched her into the upper echelons of military marksmanship. All of that ended on a Tuesday morning when Staff Sergeant Chen's voice crackled through her radio with coordinates for what intelligence had described as a routine overwatch position. Elena had been providing cover for a humanitarian mission, Army medics delivering supplies to a village school that had been damaged in recent fighting. It was supposed to be simple, safe, the kind of mission that let soldiers feel good about their service. Elena positioned herself on the roof of a partially collapsed building, her M24 rifle resting on its bipod as she scanned the surrounding area through her scope. The village was peaceful, almost sleepy in the morning heat. Children played in dusty alleyways while their mothers hung laundry and prepared meals. Her radio chattered with routine communications, supply counts, status updates, the mundane details of a mission going according to plan. The building had been weakened by previous bombardments, though intelligence hadn't deemed it structurally unsound. Elena's position offered perfect sight lines across the village center, allowing her to monitor potential threats while remaining concealed from ground-level observation. She'd been in position for nearly 2 hours when the first signs of trouble emerged. Movement in a window across the square caught her attention, a figure adjusting what appeared to be a rifle barrel. Elena's training took over instantly. She acquired the target, controlled her breathing, and prepared to take the shot that would protect her fellow soldiers below. Her finger had just begun to apply pressure to the trigger when the world exploded around her. Later, investigation revealed that insurgents had packed the building's basement with over 200 pounds of military-grade explosives, triggered remotely once they'd confirmed American forces were inside. The blast had been intended to kill everyone in Elena's squad, but their positioning in the village center had saved most of them. Elena, isolated on the rooftop, had absorbed the full force of the explosion, the building collapsed beneath her in a cascade of concrete and twisted rebar. Elena fell 3 stories through disintegrating floors, her body bouncing off debris as the structure pancaked around her. Her rifle was torn from her hands by the force of the blast, and a chunk of concrete the size of a basketball struck her left shoulder, separating the joint and sending neurological shockwaves through her entire arm. But the real damage came from a piece of rebar that grazed her skull just above her left ear, causing what military doctors would later classify as a mild traumatic brain injury with associated motor function complications. The injury affected the precise neural pathways that controlled fine motor skills in her hands, the same pathways that had made her one of the Army's most promising marksmen. Elena spent 6 months at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, enduring surgery after surgery as doctors worked to rebuild her shoulder and assess the extent of her neurological damage. Physical therapy helped restore most of her strength and mobility, but the hand tremors proved resistant to every treatment. Medications could reduce the symptoms but never eliminate them entirely, and the side effects drowsiness, difficulty concentrating, nausea made them impractical for any situation, requiring precision. Captain Brooks visited her during those long months of recovery, bringing updates from her unit and copies of the commendations that had been approved while she was hospitalized. He'd fought hard to keep her in the Army, arguing that her tactical knowledge and teaching abilities could serve the military even if her shooting days were over. But the Medical Review Board was inflexible. The tremors made her unsuitable for combat operations, and budget constraints meant there were no positions available for soldiers who couldn't deploy. Elena's medical discharge came with full honors and a disability rating that provided monthly compensation, but it felt like a death sentence for everything she'd believed about herself. The woman who had once been trusted with life and death decisions was suddenly deemed unfit for service. Her career ended by a neurological glitch that made her hands shake under stress. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. Elena's apartment in Riverside County was chosen primarily for its proximity to a VA medical center and its low rent, 2 factors that had become the primary considerations in her drastically simplified life. She'd tried various jobs, but her military skills didn't translate well to civilian employment, and her condition made many positions impossible. Working as a security guard lasted 3 weeks before her supervisor noticed the hand tremors and expressed concerns about her ability to handle weapons safely. A job at a local gun store ended when she accidentally dropped a customer's expensive pistol during a demonstration. Even civilian shooting instruction, something she'd thought might be a natural fit, proved problematic. When students lost confidence in an instructor whose hands visibly shook, that's when Elena discovered precision point shooting range, drawn initially by their advertised veteran discount and late-night hours that allowed her to practice when her symptoms were typically milder. She'd hoped that returning to shooting might help restore some sense of her former self, that muscle memory might overcome neurological damage. Instead, she'd found herself trapped in a cycle of humiliation, watching civilian shooters achieve results that would have embarrassed her in her prime, while her own performance remained frustratingly inconsistent. The tremors seemed to worsen under observation, creating a cruel feedback loop where stress about her condition made the symptoms more pronounced. Elena walked to her bathroom and stared at herself in the mirror, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the tension lines that had become permanent fixtures since her discharge. On her nightstand lay the competition flyer she'd taken from the range, its bright red paper a stark contrast to the gray walls of her apartment. $50,000. The number seemed impossibly large to someone living on disability payments and part-time work. But more than the money, Elena found herself drawn to the idea of redemption, of proving that the explosion that had taken so much from her hadn't taken everything. She picked up her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in over a year. Marcus Chun, her former staff sergeant who had retired from the Army and now worked as a civilian contractor. Marcus was one of the few people from her military days who still maintained contact, checking in occasionally with texts that Elena rarely answered. Her finger hovered over his number for several minutes before she finally pressed call. "Elena, Jesus, it's good to hear from you. How long has it been?" Marcus Chun's voice carried the same warmth and authority that had made him one of the most respected non-commissioned officers in the 82nd Airborne. Even through the phone, Elena could picture his weathered face breaking into that familiar grin that had gotten his soldiers through countless difficult moments. "Too long, Marcus. Elena hesitated, unsure how to explain why she was calling after months of ignored messages. "I need some advice about shooting." The pause on the other end of the line stretched just long enough for Elena to wonder if she'd made a mistake. Marcus had been there during her recovery, had witnessed firsthand how the tremors affected her performance. He'd also been one of the few people who understood what she'd lost when her military career ended. "Are you back to practicing?" Marcus asked carefully. "Last time we talked, you said you were taking a break from ranges." "I never really stopped," Elena admitted. "I've been going to a place called Precision Point, mostly late at night when it's empty. The staff lets me use the range after hours in exchange for helping with maintenance." This was Elena's secret, the part of her life that even Sarah at the range didn't fully understand. 3 nights a week, after the last paying customer left and the main lights were dimmed, Elena would spend hours alone with her rifle and her demons. The arrangement had started accidentally. She'd been at the range late one evening when the overnight security guard called in sick, and the manager had asked if she'd be willing to stay until closing in exchange for free range time. During those solitary sessions, something magical happened. Without the pressure of observation, without the weight of expectation and judgment, Elena's hands would gradually steady. The tremor never disappeared completely, but it became manageable, like a radio signal she could tune, until it was barely audible. In the silence and darkness, she could remember what it felt like to be a soldier, to trust her training and her instincts. "How's it going?" Marcus asked. "Are you finding any improvement?" "Some nights are better than others," Elena said, walking to her window and looking out at the city skyline. "Marcus, there's a competition coming up. Big prize money, and they're calling the final challenge the ultimate test of precision marksmanship. I'm thinking about entering." Another pause, longer this time. Elena could almost hear Marcus weighing his words carefully, probably remembering her condition and the last time she'd expressed confidence about her shooting abilities. "Elena, you know I believe in you. I always have. But competition shooting is different from practice. There's pressure, crowds, other shooters watching every move. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of environment?" Elena closed her eyes, remembering the humiliation she'd endured at Tommy Rodriguez's hands just yesterday. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I need to try. I can't keep living like this, Marcus. I can't keep being the person everyone expects me to be, the broken veteran who can't hold a rifle steady. Tell me about your night sessions. What kind of groups are you shooting?" Elena smiled despite herself. Marcus was slipping into instructor mode, the same analytical approach he'd used when evaluating soldiers for advanced training. "At 100 yards, I can keep 10 shots within a 2-inch circle on good nights. At 200 yards, maybe 4 inches if I'm really dialed in." She didn't mention the best night 2 weeks ago when everything had clicked perfectly. She'd been alone in the range at nearly midnight, working through a series of precision drills that Marcus himself had taught her years ago in Afghanistan. Her hands had been unusually steady, her breathing controlled, her mind clear of the anxiety that usually plagued her. On that night, Elena had attempted something she hadn't tried since her military days, a series of shots at 300 yards, using the range's electronic target system. 10 rounds fired slowly and methodically, each one guided by muscle memory and instincts that years of neurological damage hadn't been able to completely erase. When she'd activated the target retrieval system and examined the results, Elena had stared in disbelief. 8 of the 10 shots had struck within a 3-inch circle, with the other 2 missing by less than an inch. It was the kind of performance that would have earned praise from her military instructors, the kind of shooting that proved the fundamentals were still there, buried beneath the tremors and self-doubt. "Those are solid numbers," Marcus said, and Elena could hear the surprise in his voice. "Better than I expected, honestly." "What's your setup?" "Same rifle I used in the service, well, the civilian version. I managed to configure it almost exactly. Like my old M24, same scope, same trigger, even the same type of stock. It helps with muscle memory." Elena's rifle was her most prized possession, purchased with her first disability check despite the financial strain. She'd spent months researching civilian equivalents to military sniper systems, eventually settling on a Remington 700 that she'd modified extensively. The work had been done by a local gunsmith who specialized in precision rifles, a gruff former Marine named Davidson, who'd given her a significant discount after learning about her military background. "Muscle memory is huge," Marcus agreed. "Your body remembers even when your mind doubts." "Elena, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Are you doing this to prove something to other people, or are you doing it for yourself?" The question hit deeper than Elena had expected. She thought about Tommy Rodriguez's laughter, about the whispered comments that followed her through the range, about the looks of pity from well-meaning people who saw her condition and assumed she was helpless. "Both, I think," she said finally. "I'm tired of being seen as damaged goods. But I'm also tired of believing it myself. Some nights, when I'm shooting well, I remember who I used to be. I remember feeling confident and capable. I want that back, Marcus, even if it's just for one day." "All right," Marcus said, and Elena could hear decision crystallizing in his voice. "If you're serious about this competition, we're going to do it right. I'm driving down this weekend. We're going to assess your current skill level, identify weak points, and develop a training plan. But Elena, and this is important, if I think you're not ready, if I think this is going to do more harm, then good, I'm going to tell you to walk away. Can you handle that?" Elena felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with determination and just a touch of the confidence that had once defined her. "I can handle it." "Good. One more thing. This competition you mentioned, what exactly is this ultimate test they're advertising?" "I don't know specifics yet," Elena admitted. "The flyer just says it's something that's never been attempted in competition before. They're calling it the shot that separates legends from mere marksmen." Marcus chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Sounds like marketing hype to me, but we'll prepare for anything. Elena, I want you to spend the next few days documenting your practice sessions. Write down everything: group sizes, environmental conditions, how you're feeling physically and mentally. When I get there, we'll have a baseline to work from." After they hung up, Elena sat in her apartment, feeling something she hadn't experienced since before the explosion: anticipation for the future. For 3 years, she'd been living day to day, managing symptoms and accepting limitations. Now, for the first time, she was planning for something bigger. She pulled out a notebook and began writing down everything she could remember about her recent practice sessions. As she worked, Elena found herself thinking not about the tremors or the anxiety or the long odds against her success, but about the feeling of a perfect trigger pull, the satisfaction of a bullet finding its intended target, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the explosion that had taken so much from her hadn't taken everything after all. The competition was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to rediscover the shooter she'd once been, to prove that Elena Vasquez was more than the sum of her limitations. 6 weeks to prepare for whatever impossible challenge awaited her. What she couldn't know was that the challenge would indeed be impossible by any conventional standard, A shot that would require not just skill and preparation, but the kind of precision that existed at the very edge of human capability. The atmosphere at Precision Point Shooting Range crackled with unusual energy the following Saturday morning. Elena arrived to find the parking lot packed with vehicles she'd never seen before. Expensive trucks with gun manufacturer decals, SUVs bearing license plates from across the state, and even a few cars with out-of-state plates suggesting competitors had traveled significant distances for whatever announcement was planned. Inside, the range buzzed with conversation as dozens of shooters gathered around a temporary stage that had been erected near the front desk. Elena recognized most of the local regulars, including Tommy Rodriguez, who stood near the front with his usual group of admirers, but there were many faces she didn't know, serious-looking men and women with the bearing of professional competitors and military veterans. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming," announced James Morrison, the range owner, as he stepped up to a microphone. Morrison was a former Army officer who'd built Precision Point into one of California's premier shooting facilities, and his events typically drew significant attention from the competitive shooting community. "Today, we're announcing something unprecedented in the world of precision marksmanship." Elena found a spot near the back of the crowd, noting how Sarah Kim caught her eye and offered an encouraging smile from behind the registration desk. The young woman had been one of the few people who'd shown genuine excitement when Elena mentioned she might enter the competition. The Riverside County Precision Shooting Championship has always prided itself on pushing the boundaries of what's possible with a rifle, Morrison continued. "This year, we're taking that philosophy to its absolute limit. Our final challenge will be something that has never been attempted in competitive shooting, tests that will separate the merely skilled from the truly legendary." A murmur ran through the crowd as Morrison gestured to a large display board that had been covered with black cloth. With theatrical flair, he pulled away the covering to reveal a detailed diagram that made several people in the audience gasp audibly. The image showed a target setup unlike anything Elena had ever seen. At a distance of 200 yards, a single razor blade was mounted vertically on a specially designed stand. The challenge was elegantly simple and impossibly difficult. Competitors would need to fire a bullet with such precision that it struck the razor blade's edge perfectly, splitting the projectile cleanly in half. "The Razor Split Challenge," Morrison announced, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. 200 yards, one shot, one razor blade, measuring exactly 0.004 inches thick. The competitor who can split a bullet on that edge will win $50,000, a full sponsorship package with Apex ammunition, and a place in shooting history. Elena stared at the diagram, her mind automatically calculating the precision required for such a shot. The margin of error would be measured in fractions of millimeters. Even the slightest deviation in bullet placement caused by wind, breathing, trigger control, or weapon movement would result in complete failure. It was the kind of shot that existed more in legend than reality. "That's insane," someone whispered behind Elena. "Nobody can make that shot consistently." "Consistently?" Tommy Rodriguez's voice boomed from the front of the crowd. "Hell, I'd be impressed if anyone could make it once. We're talking about threading a needle at 2 football fields." Morrison smiled at the reaction. "I understand the skepticism. That's exactly why we're offering such a substantial prize. We've consulted with ballistics experts, former military snipers, and competitive shooters from around the world. The consensus is that this shot represents the absolute pinnacle of human marksmanship capability." An older man near the front raised his hand. Elena recognized him as Bill Patterson, a former police sniper who'd won numerous regional competitions. "What happens if multiple shooters make the shot?" "Based on expert analysis, we don't expect that scenario," Morrison replied. "But if by some miracle multiple competitors succeed, we'll move to a sudden death format with increasingly difficult variations." However, our consultants believe the odds of even one successful attempt are less than 5%. Elena found herself studying the diagram more intently, her military training automatically breaking down the technical requirements. The razor blade would need to be perfectly perpendicular to the bullet's path. Environmental factors like wind, temperature, and humidity would have to be accounted for with mathematical precision. The rifle would need to be zeroed perfectly, and the shooter would need to execute fundamentals flawlessly. But as she analyzed the challenge, Elena felt something unexpected, not intimidation, but fascination. This was the kind of shot that separated theoretical marksmanship from practical application, the difference between range performance and real-world capability under pressure. Registration begins Monday, Morrison announced. Entry fee is $500, which includes access to practice sessions and technical briefings about the challenge setup. The competition takes place in 6 weeks with preliminary rounds, eliminating all but the top 10 shooters who'll attempt the Razor Split Challenge. $500. Elena felt her heart sink as reality intruded on her growing excitement. Her monthly disability payment barely covered rent and basic expenses, and she'd been saving for months just to afford ammunition for her practice sessions. The entry fee alone represented a significant financial sacrifice. As the crowd began to disperse, Elena overheard conversations that ranged from excited to dismissive. Several competitors were already discussing modifications to their rifles and ammunition, while others seemed convinced the challenge was nothing more than an elaborate publicity stunt. "Elena," Sarah Kim appeared at her side as the crowd thinned. "Are you going to enter? Please tell me you're going to enter." "I want to," Elena said honestly. "But the entry fee... What if I told you someone wanted to sponsor your entry?" Sarah interrupted, her eyes bright with excitement. Elena stared at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" "Mr. Davidson, the gunsmith who worked on your rifle, he was here during the announcement. He asked me to find you and tell you he wants to talk. Something about believing you have a real chance at this." Elena felt a flutter of hope mixed with disbelief. Davidson was known throughout the local shooting community as a master craftsman and a shrewd judge of talent. If he was willing to back her entry, it meant he saw something in her performance that others had missed. "He's waiting in the workshop area," Sarah continued. "Elena, I've seen you shoot when you think nobody's watching. I've seen the targets you leave behind after your practice sessions. You might actually have a chance at this." As Elena walked toward the workshop area, her mind raced with possibilities and doubts in equal measure. The Razor Split Challenge represented everything she'd lost and everything she hoped to regain: precision, confidence, respect, and perhaps most importantly, proof that the explosion hadn't taken her true capabilities. She found Davidson bent over a rifle action, his weathered hands moving with the precision of someone who'd spent decades perfecting his craft. At 62, he was a legend among competitive shooters, a former Marine sniper who'd built rifles for Olympic champions and military special operations units. "Elena," he said without looking up from his work, "I've been thinking about that rifle we built together. Been wondering if you've been putting it to proper use." "I practice when I can," Elena replied carefully. Davidson finally looked up, his gray eyes studying her with the intensity of someone who could read a person's capabilities in their posture and expression. "Sarah's been showing me your practice targets, the ones from your late-night sessions. That's some impressive shooting for someone who supposedly got shaky hands." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You've been watching me?" "Security cameras," Davidson said matter-of-factly. "I help maintain the electronic systems here. Been curious about the woman who comes in after hours and shoots groups that would make most of these weekend warriors weep with envy." He sat down his tools and faced her fully. "Elena, I've been building precision rifles for 30 years. I've worked with Olympic champions, military snipers, and competitive shooters who've won more trophies than they can count. Most of them couldn't make the shot Morrison just described, even under perfect conditions. Elena waited, unsure where the conversation was heading. But sometimes, Davidson continued, real precision isn't about perfect conditions. Sometimes it's about being able to perform when everything is imperfect, when your hands shake, when the pressure is overwhelming, when everyone expects you to fail. That's when you find out who can really shoot and who's just been lucky at the range. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a check already made out to Pooh. Precision point shooting range for exactly $500. I'm sponsoring your entry, Elena. Not because I think you're going to win, but because I think you deserve the chance to find out what you're really capable of. Elena stared at the check, overwhelmed by the unexpected gesture of faith from someone whose opinion carried significant weight in the shooting community. Why? She asked simply. Davidson smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Because 30 years ago, a young Marine with a slight stutter was told he'd never be sniper material. Too nervous under pressure, they said. That Marine was me, and the person who believed in him anyway changed his life. He handed her the check. The razor split challenge isn't just about perfect marksmanship, Elena. It's about being able to perform the impossible when it matters most. Based on what I've seen, you might be the only person in this competition who's actually qualified for that kind of pressure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena sat in her car outside Precision Point for 20 minutes after accepting Davidson's sponsorship, staring at the check that represented both an incredible opportunity and a terrifying commitment. The piece of paper in her hands meant she could officially enter the competition, but it also meant there would be no backing out, no quiet retreat if her confidence faltered. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Driving down tomorrow as planned. Bring everything, rifle, ammo, shooting logs, we have work to do. The reality of what she was about to attempt began settling in as Elena drove home through the Saturday afternoon traffic. In 6 weeks, she would stand before hundreds of spectators and attempt a shot that ballistics experts considered nearly impossible. The same hands that had been mocked for their tremors would need to guide a bullet with such precision that it split cleanly on a razor blade, thinner than a human hair. That evening, Elena spread all her shooting equipment across her living room floor, conducting a detailed inventory of everything she would need for serious competition preparation. Her rifle, the modified Remington 700 that Davidson had helped her configure, lay carefully disassembled for inspection. Each component had been meticulously maintained, but Elena knew that for the level of precision required, even microscopic imperfections could mean the difference between success and failure. Her ammunition supply was more concerning. Elena had been hand-loading her own cartridges to save money, carefully measuring powder charges and selecting bullets for consistency. But the razor split challenge would demand ammunition manufactured to tolerances beyond what she could achieve. In her small apartment setup, she would need match-grade factory loads or access to professional reloading equipment. Elena opened her shooting notebook and reviewed the data she'd been collecting from her practice sessions. The numbers told a story of gradual improvement. Her group sizes had been shrinking steadily over the past months, and her consistency under different environmental conditions had improved markedly. But all of that had been accomplished during private practice sessions when the only pressure came from her own expectations. Competition would be different. There would be spectators, officials, other competitors watching her every move. There would be the weight of representation, not just for herself, but for every veteran who'd been written off because of their injuries. Elena had seen how the military and veteran communities followed competitive shooting, how stories of success and failure spread quickly through social media and informal networks. Her phone rang, interrupting her inventory and planning. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize with a local area code. "Elena, this is Captain Brooks." I hope you don't mind that I tracked down your number. Elena's breath caught. Captain Brooks had been her commanding officer during her final deployment, the man who'd fought hardest to keep her in the Army after her injury. She hadn't spoken to him since her medical discharge ceremony 3 years ago. Captain Brooks, she managed. This is unexpected. I heard through the veteran network that you're entering a major shooting competition. News travels fast in our community, especially when it involves someone with your background. Elena wondered who had been talking and how word had spread so quickly. The veteran community in Southern California was tight-knit, and she supposed Davidson or someone else at the range might have connections she wasn't aware of. I wanted to call and tell you how proud I am that you're competing, Brooks continued. I know how difficult these past few years have been, and I know how much courage it takes to put yourself back out there. I haven't done anything yet, Elena said. I might fail spectacularly. Elena, do you remember what I told you during your final performance review before the incident? Brooks asked. I said you had something that couldn't be taught, the ability to perform under pressure, to make impossible shots when everything was falling apart around you. That ability didn't disappear because of some neurological damage. Elena closed her eyes, remembering the conversation. It had taken place just days before the explosion, during what was supposed to be a routine review of her performance and future career prospects. Brooks had been discussing recommendations for advanced training, potential leadership roles, and the possibility of instructor positions. The thing about pressure, Brooks continued, is that it reveals what people are really made of. Most shooters perform well when conditions are perfect, when they have time to think and adjust and second-guess themselves. But the truly exceptional ones, the ones who make shots that matter, they perform best when there's no time to think, when instinct and training have to take over. Captain, I appreciate the call, but my hands shake now. You've seen the medical reports. I've also seen your combat record, Brooks replied firmly. Elena, you made shots under enemy fire that seasoned snipers couldn't duplicate on a practice range. You saved lives with rifles that were damaged from positions that were compromised in conditions that would have broken most people. A little neurological damage doesn't erase that fundamental capability. After they hung up, Elena found herself thinking about pressure and performance in ways she hadn't considered before. Every shot she'd made during her military service had been under some form of pressure, environmental, tactical, or emotional. The controlled environment of a shooting range was actually more artificial than the chaotic conditions where she'd learned to excel. She picked up her rifle and went through the familiar ritual of dry fire practice, feeling the trigger break cleanly as she aimed at a target across her living room. Her hands showed the familiar tremor, but as she focused on her breathing and trigger control, the shaking seemed to diminish slightly. Elena spent the rest of the evening researching the Razor Split Challenge online, finding videos of similar shots attempted by professional marksmen and military snipers. Most attempts failed, with bullets passing just millimeters away from their intended targets. The few successful attempts she found had been accomplished under controlled laboratory conditions, often requiring multiple tries and extensive setup. Time. The challenge Morrison had described would allow only one attempt per competitor, with standard competition time limits and public observation. It was designed to test not just marksmanship skill, but the ability to perform under maximum pressure. Sunday morning arrived gray and overcast, with the kind of atmospheric conditions that serious shooters learn to read and compensate for. Elena arrived at Precision Point early, using her after-hours access to prepare for Marcus's arrival. She wanted everything ready when her former instructor arrived, targets set up, equipment organized, and a clear plan for assessment and training. Marcus arrived at exactly 0900 hours, his punctuality unchanged from their military days. He emerged from his truck carrying a large equipment case and wearing the same focused expression Elena remembered from their training sessions in Afghanistan. "Soldier," he said with a slight smile, the greeting carrying echoes of their shared service. "Sergeant," Elena replied, surprised by how naturally she fell back into military bearing in his presence. Marcus set down his case and looked around the empty shooting range with the appraising eye of someone who'd trained marksmen on ranges around the world. Decent facility, good sight lines, professional setup. "Now show me what we're working with." Elena led him to her preferred shooting position and began unpacking her equipment. Marcus watched silently as she assembled her rifle, noting her movements and the care with which she handled each component. "Muscle memory looks good," he observed. "Your manipulation is still solid. Now let's see what kind of groups you're shooting." Elena settled into her shooting position, acutely aware of Marcus's observation, but determined to demonstrate her current capability honestly. She fired 5 rounds at a target positioned at 100 yards, trying to ignore the tremor in her hands and focus on the fundamentals he'd taught her years ago. When they examined the target, Marcus studied the group pattern with professional interest. The 5 shots formed a cluster roughly 2.5 inches across, not perfect, but respectable for someone dealing with neurological challenges. "Not bad," Marcus said finally. "But we're going to need better than not bad for what you're attempting. Elena, show me what you can do when you're not thinking about your hands." The comment surprised her. "What do you mean?" "I mean shoot like you did in Afghanistan. Stop analyzing every tremor and start trusting your training. Your hands shake, we've established that. Now let's see what happens when you stop fighting it and start working with it." Marcus spent the next hour observing Elena's shooting, making notes and occasionally offering suggestions. Gradually, she began to relax into familiar patterns, letting muscle memory and training take precedence over conscious thought about her condition. The difference was remarkable. When Elena stopped focusing on her tremors and started focusing on her targets, her groups tightened noticeably. The shaking didn't disappear, but it seemed to matter less when integrated into her overall shooting process. "There she is," Marcus said quietly after Elena fired a particularly tight group. "There's the shooter I remember." As they packed up for the day, Marcus outlined an intensive training schedule that would prepare Elena for every aspect of the competition: technical precision, pressure management, and the mental preparation necessary for attempting something at the very edge of human capability. 6 weeks, he said. "That's enough time to get you ready, but only if you're willing to commit completely. No half measures, no backup plans. Are you in?" Elena looked at her rifle, at the targets that showed steady improvement, at the check from Davidson that represented someone else's faith in her abilities. "I'm in." "Good," Marcus replied, "because the real work starts tomorrow." 5 weeks of intensive training with Marcus had transformed Elena's shooting in ways she hadn't thought possible. The daily sessions had been grueling hours of position work, breathing exercises, ammunition testing, and mental preparation that pushed her far beyond her comfort zone. Marcus had structured the training like a military campaign, with specific objectives, measurable benchmarks, and relentless attention to detail. Now, standing in the competitor staging area at Precision Point on the morning of the championship, Elena felt a strange calm settling over her. The tremor in her hands was still present, but weeks of working with Marcus had taught her to incorporate it into her shooting process rather than fighting against it. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Riverside County Precision Shooting Championship." James Morrison's voice boomed across the range as nearly 300 spectators filled the viewing areas. Elena had never seen the facility so crowded, with professional cameras documenting every aspect of the competition and representatives from major shooting sports publications covering the event. The preliminary rounds would eliminate all but 10 competitors who would advance to the Razor Split Challenge. Elena studied her competition as they gathered for the opening, briefing 42 shooters representing every level of experience from Olympic-level competitors to wealthy amateurs hoping to buy their way to glory. Tommy Rodriguez stood near the front of the group, resplendent in expensive tactical gear and radiating the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own abilities. He'd spent the weeks leading up to the competition posting videos on social media, demonstrating his shooting skills and making dismissive comments about veterans who couldn't handle the pressure of real competition. "First stage is precision shooting at known distances," Morrison announced. 100, 200, and 300 yards. 5 shots at each distance, scored for accuracy. Top 20 advanced to the second stage. Elena felt her pulse quicken slightly, but forced herself to focus on breathing and mental preparation. Marcus had drilled her extensively at these exact distances, and her recent practice scores suggested she could compete with anyone in the field. "Competitors will shoot in groups of 7, Morrison continued. "Range commands will be given by our head judge, former Marine Scout sniper Sergeant Major Williams." Elena's group was called 5th, giving her time to observe the early shooters and assess both the environmental conditions and the competition level. The first groups included several recognizable names from the competitive shooting circuit, men and women who made their living traveling from match to match, accumulating prize money and sponsorship deals. Their performance was impressive, but not intimidating. Elena watched group after group fire respectable scores, noting wind patterns and how different competitors handled the pressure of public observation. Several shooters struggled noticeably, with the crowds, their normally steady hands showing tremors that Elena recognized from her own experience. Elena Vasquez, Lane 4, the range officer called when her group was announced. She walked to her assigned position, acutely aware of the whispered conversations that followed her movement. Word had spread through the shooting community about her background, the disabled veteran with hand tremors who thought she could compete with elite marksmen. Some spectators seemed genuinely curious about her performance, while others appeared to be waiting for entertainment in the form of spectacular failure. Tommy Rodriguez had drawn lane 6, just 2 positions away from Elena, as they prepared their equipment. He made sure his voice carried to nearby spectators and competitors. "Interesting that they let anyone enter these days," he said to his shooting partner. "I guess they need entry fees from everyone, even people who probably shouldn't be handling weapons." Elena ignored the comment, focusing instead on the pre-shooting checklist Marcus had drilled into her. She verified her scope settings, checked her ammunition, and went through the mental preparation routine they'd practiced hundreds of times. "Shooters, prepare for the 100-yard stage," Sergeant Major Williams announced. "You will have 2 minutes to fire 5 shots for score. Load and make ready." Elena's first shot broke cleanly, her rifle recoiling smoothly as the bullet traveled downrange. Through her scope, she could see the impact, a solid hit in the 9 ring. Not perfect, but well within the scoring area. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, her mind clear of the anxiety that had plagued her during previous public appearances. 4 more shots followed in quick succession, each one placed with deliberate precision. When the targets were scored, Elena's group measured 2.1 inches center to center, a respectable showing that put her in contention for advancement. Tommy's group at 100 yards measured 2.8 inches, a result that clearly frustrated him based on his visible reaction to the scoring announcement. The 200-yard stage proved more challenging for most competitors. Environmental factors became more significant at extended range, and several shooters who'd performed well at 100 yards struggled with wind estimation and trajectory compensation. Elena settled into her shooting position with growing confidence. This was the distance where her weeks of training with Marcus had shown the most dramatic improvement. She'd learned to read environmental conditions instinctively, using visual cues and physical sensations to adjust for factors that affected bullet flight. Her first shot, at 200 yards, struck the target's 10 ring in near perfect placement that drew murmurs of surprise from spectators who'd been expecting poor performance from the veteran with shaky hands. 4 more shots followed, each one placed with increasing precision as Elena fell into the focused state that Marcus called shooter's mind. When the targets were scored, Elena's 200-yard group measured 1.7 inches, a result that placed her among the top 5 performers in her relay, and well ahead of most competitors who'd been favored to advance. Tommy's performance at 200 yards deteriorated further, his group spreading to over 4 inches as pressure and frustration affected his normally solid technique. Elena could see him checking and rechecking his equipment, searching for mechanical explanations for what was clearly a performance issue. The 300-yard stage separated serious competitors from casual shooters. At this distance, minor errors in fundamentals became major problems, and environmental factors could cause even well-aimed shots to miss the scoring area entirely. Elena approached the line with quiet confidence, drawing on muscle memory developed during countless military missions where 300-yard shots had been routine requirements. The target appeared smaller through her scope, but not impossibly. So she'd made similar shots under far more challenging conditions in Afghanistan. Her shooting process had become automatic after weeks of intensive practice. Settle into position, control breathing, read environmental conditions, acquire sight picture, apply trigger pressure smoothly and consistently. The rifle's recoil felt familiar and comfortable, like reconnecting with an old friend. 5 shots in 90 seconds, each one carefully placed and deliberately executed. When the targets were retrieved, Elena's 300-yard group measured 2.3 inches, a result that would have been impressive for any competitor, but was particularly noteworthy for someone who'd been written off as unsuitable for precision work. The preliminary scoring placed Elena 7th overall out of 42 competitors, easily qualifying her for the second stage and earning respectful nods from competitors who'd previously dismissed her as a publicity stunt. Tommy Rodriguez finished 23rd, failing to advance and storming off the range without congratulating the qualifiers or participating in the traditional post-stage discussions that were customary among competitive shooters. "Not bad for someone with shaky hands," Sarah Kim said as Elena packed her equipment. "You've got people talking, that's for sure." Elena looked around at the other qualifiers, a group that included former military snipers, Olympic-level competitors, and professional shooting instructors. These were serious marksmen with impressive credentials and proven track records in high-level competition. "Second stage tomorrow," Elena replied. "Then we find out who gets to attempt the impossible." Marcus appeared at her side, his expression showing the quiet satisfaction of an instructor whose student had exceeded expectations. "How do you feel?" "Ready," Elena said, and for the first time in 3 years, she genuinely meant it. The Razor Split Challenge was less than 24 hours away, and Elena Vasquez was no longer the broken veteran everyone expected to fail. She was a competitor with a legitimate chance at achieving something legendary. The morning of the Razor Split Challenge dawned clear and windless perfect conditions for what James Morrison had called the most demanding shot in competitive shooting history. Elena arrived at Precision Point 2 hours early, wanting time to prepare mentally before the crowds and cameras arrived for the main event. The range had been transformed overnight. A special shooting platform had been constructed exactly 200 yards from the target area, where a single razor blade now stood mounted on its custom stand. Television crews from 3 networks were setting up equipment, and representatives from major shooting sports magazines had claimed prime viewing positions. Elena found Marcus already at the range, studying wind flags and atmospheric conditions, with the intensity of a meteorologist predicting a hurricane. 5 years of military service had taught both of them that environmental factors could turn a perfect shot into a spectacular miss, and today's conditions would need to be read with mathematical precision. "How's it looking?" Elena asked, setting down her equipment case next to the shooting platform. "Better than we could have hoped," Marcus replied, pointing to the wind flags positioned at 50-yard intervals down the range. Light and variable, maybe 2 to 3 miles per hour from the northwest. Temperatures steady at 68 degrees. Humidity at 45%. If conditions hold, we won't need much environmental compensation. Elena nodded, running through the ballistic calculations they'd practiced countless times during their training sessions. At 200 yards, even a slight crosswind could push a bullet several inches off target, more than enough to miss the razor blade entirely. Today's calm conditions would eliminate one of the major variables that made the shot so challenging. The 10 qualifiers began arriving for the mandatory equipment inspection and final briefing. Elena recognized most of them from the previous day's competition. Serious shooters with impressive credentials and expensive equipment. Several approached her with respectful greetings, a marked change from the dismissive treatment she'd endured just weeks earlier. Elena Vasquez, a middle-aged man with graying temples and the bearing of a former military officer, extended his hand. "Colonel Peterson, retired. I wanted to introduce myself before we get started." Elena shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested someone accustomed to command responsibility. "Colonel, I've been following your story through the Veteran Network," Peterson continued. "What you've accomplished. Just getting here, overcoming injury, dealing with public skepticism, training your way back to competitive level. That's impressive regardless of what happens today." "Thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from someone with your background." Peterson smiled. "I'm not just being polite. I've shot in competitions for 15 years since retiring, and I've never seen anyone improve as dramatically as you have. In such a short time, your preliminary scores were outstanding." As more competitors gathered, Elena overheard conversations that revealed the enormous pressure everyone was feeling. The razor split challenge had captured attention far beyond the local shooting community. Videos and articles about the competition had been shared thousands of times on social media, and several major news outlets were planning to feature the event in their sports coverage. James Morrison called the competitors together for the final briefing, his usually confident demeanor showing signs of nervousness about the historic nature of what they were attempting. "Ladies and gentlemen, you represent the finest precision shooters in the region," he began. "What you're about to attempt has never been successfully completed in competitive conditions. Our ballistics consultants estimate the precision required to split a bullet cleanly on a razor blade represents the absolute limit of what's possible with conventional rifles and ammunition." He gestured toward the target area, where the razor blade gleamed in the morning sunlight. "The blade measures exactly 0.004 inches thick and is positioned perfectly perpendicular to your line of fire. A successful split requires the bullet to strike the blade's edge with such precision that it divides the projectile into 2 equal halves." Elena studied the setup through her binoculars, noting how the blade had been mounted to ensure perfect stability and positioning. Even the slightest deviation in the blade's angle would make the shot impossible, but the engineering appeared flawless. "Shooting order will be determined by yesterday's preliminary scores," Morrison continued. "Highest qualifier shoots first, with the final competitor being our 7th place finisher." That meant Elena would shoot last, a position that could be either an advantage or a tremendous psychological burden, depending on the performance of earlier competitors. If someone made the shot before her turn, the pressure would be off, but the prize would be gone. If all 9 competitors ahead of her failed, she would face the full weight of expectation as the final hope for anyone to achieve success. "Each competitor gets exactly 3 minutes on the firing line," Morrison explained. "You may take as much time as you need for preparation, but once you chamber a round, the clock begins. 1 shot only, no ranging shots, no practice attempts, no second chances." The gravity of what they were attempting settled over the group like fog. Elena had made thousands of shots during her military career, many under extreme pressure and challenging conditions. But she'd never faced a situation where success or failure would be determined by millimeters, where the margin of error was so small that even perfect technique might not be sufficient. "Any questions?" Morrison asked. Colonel Peterson raised his hand. "What happens if environmental conditions change during the competition? Wind, temperature shifts, that sort of thing." "Each competitor will receive updated environmental readings immediately before their attempt," Morrison replied. "Our meteorological equipment provides real-time data on all factors that might affect bullet flight." Elena appreciated the thoroughness of the setup. Morrison and his team had clearly thought through every variable that could influence the outcome, creating conditions as fair and controlled as possible for such an extreme challenge. As the briefing concluded, Elena noticed camera crews positioning themselves to capture every aspect of the competition. The media attention was unlike anything she'd experienced, even during her military service. Reporters were interviewing competitors, and she could see photographers testing angles and lighting for the dramatic shots they hoped to capture. "Nervous?" Marcus asked as they walked toward the preparation area. "Focused," Elena replied, though she could feel her heart rate beginning to increase as the reality of the moment approached. "Marcus, regardless of what happens today, I want you to know how much your training meant to me. You gave me back something I thought was gone forever." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "Elena, I've trained a lot of shooters over the years. Most of them had perfect conditions, unlimited ammunition, and no real pressure beyond their own expectations. You've trained through injury, overcome neurological challenges, and faced down public skepticism that would have broken most people." He paused, looking toward the razor blade that would determine her fate in less than an hour. "Win or lose today, you've already accomplished something remarkable. But I want you to remember something when you're on that firing line. You're not shooting to prove anything to the people watching. You're shooting because you're a marksman, and marksmen take the shots that matter." Elena felt a familiar calm settling over her as the final minutes of preparation ticked away. The tremor in her hands was still present, but it felt different now, not like a disability to overcome, but like a part of her shooting process that had been integrated and compensated for through weeks of dedicated training. The first competitor was called to the line, and Elena watched as he went through his preparation routine. The crowd fell silent as he chambered his round and settled into his shooting position. The shot rang out across the range, echoing off the hills beyond the target area. Through binoculars, Elena could see that the bullet had passed just millimeters to the left of the razor blade, close enough to suggest the shot was possible, but not close enough to achieve success. 1 down, 8 to go. Elena's turn was approaching, and with it, her chance to prove that sometimes the most unlikely people are capable of the most extraordinary things. 8 attempts had been made, and 8 bullets had missed the razor blade by margins measured in millimeters. Elena watched each competitor's technique with professional interest, noting how the pressure affected even the most experienced shooters. 2 had rushed their shots, 3 had overcompensated for environmental factors that barely existed, and 3 others had simply fallen victim to the mathematical reality that hitting a target 0.004 inches wide at 200 yards required precision beyond normal human capability. Colonel Peterson, shooting 8th, had come closest to success. His bullet had passed so near the razor blade that spectators thought he'd made contact, but high-speed cameras confirmed a miss by less than 2 millimeters. The retired officer had shaken his head in frustrated admiration for the challenge's difficulty as he walked off the firing line. Final competitor, Elena Vasquez, to the firing line, the range officer announced. Elena rose from her position in the competitor area, acutely aware that hundreds of eyes were focused on her movement. The crowd had grown throughout the morning as word spread about the competition, and now included local television crews, shooting sports journalists, and what appeared to be a significant contingent of veterans who'd come to support one of their own. She walked to the firing platform carrying her rifle and a single cartridge the match-grade round that Marcus had helped her select after extensive testing. They'd fired dozens of similar cartridges during training, measuring velocity consistency and accuracy potential, until they'd identified ammunition that performed with laboratory-level precision. The shooting platform felt solid beneath her feet as Elena began her preparation routine. She extended her rifle's bipod legs and adjusted them for perfect height, ensuring that her sight picture would be identical to what she'd practiced hundreds of times during training. The familiar weight of the weapon settled into her shoulder. As she positioned herself behind the scope, through her binoculars, the razor blade looked impossibly small, a thin vertical line that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon sunlight. Elena forced herself to breathe steadily, drawing on meditation techniques that Marcus had taught her for managing pressure and anxiety. "Competitor has 2 minutes remaining," the range officer announced. Elena chambered her round with deliberate precision, feeling the cartridge slide smoothly into the rifle's chamber. The action closed with a solid click that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere. She settled into her shooting position, adjusting her body until everything felt natural and stable. The view through her scope was crystal clear. Elena could see the razor blade in perfect detail, noting how it had been positioned exactly perpendicular to her line of sight. Environmental conditions remained ideal. Wind flags showed minimal movement, and atmospheric conditions were stable. She began her breathing routine, inhaling deeply and exhaling slowly to reduce her heart rate and minimize body movement. The tremor in her hands was present but manageable, integrated into her shooting process rather than fighting against it. 1 minute remaining. Elena placed her finger on the trigger and began applying the slow, steady pressure that Marcus had drilled into her through countless practice sessions. Her crosshairs settled on the razor blade, and for a moment, the entire world contracted to that tiny point of metal gleaming in the distance. But something felt wrong. Elena lifted her head from the scope and looked downrange with her naked eye, using peripheral vision to assess environmental conditions. A subtle shift in the wind flags caught her attention. The lightest possible breeze, barely perceptible, but enough to affect bullet flight over 200 yards. 30 seconds remaining. Elena made a micro-adjustment to her point of aim, compensating for the wind shift with movements so small they were barely visible. She settled back into her scope and reacquired her target, noting how the crosshairs tracked perfectly onto the razor blade. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm Marcus had taught her. Inhale, exhale halfway, hold, fire. Elena's finger began its final pressure on the trigger, applying force with the consistency of a machine, while her mind focused entirely on the thin line of metal that would determine her fate. The rifle fired with perfect surprise, the way a precision shot should break. Elena felt the familiar recoil impulse as the bullet began its journey toward the target, but she maintained her position behind the scope, watching through the magnified optics as the projectile covered 200 yards in less than a quarter of a second. The impact was visible even through her scope, a tiny spark of light as the bullet struck the razor blade's edge with mathematical precision. Elena heard the distant metallic ping of contact, followed immediately by a collective gasp from the crowd as they realized what they'd witnessed. "Target struck," the range officer announced, his voice carrying a note of awe. "Officials are examining the target for confirmation of a successful split." Elena remained in position, her rifle still aimed downrange, afraid to move or breathe or do anything that might somehow change what had just occurred. Through her scope, she could see officials gathering around the target area, examining the razor blade and the ground behind it with magnifying equipment. The examination seemed to take forever, though Elena knew it was probably less than 2 minutes. She could hear murmured conversations from the crowd, mixed with the sound of camera shutters clicking rapidly as photographers documented the historic moment. Finally, the head judge's voice crackled through the range's loudspeaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have confirmed a successful razor split. The bullet has been divided into two equal halves, with clean separation at the point of contact. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers that echoed across the range like thunder. Elena finally lifted her head from her scope, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. The impossible shot, the one that ballistics experts had called nearly beyond human capability, had been made by a disabled veteran whose hands trembled under stress. Marcus was the first to reach her, his weathered face showing a mixture of pride and amazement that Elena had never seen before. "Elena, that was ... He shook his head, apparently unable to find adequate words. "In 30 years of training marksmen, I've never seen anything like that shot." Sarah Kim appeared next, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "You did it! You actually did it!" Elena stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady as adrenaline coursed through her system. The crowd was still applauding, and she could see reporters pushing forward with cameras and microphones, eager to capture her reaction to the historic achievement. But in that moment, Elena wasn't thinking about prize money or media attention or proving anything to the people who doubted her. She was thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point, the explosion that had nearly ended everything, the years of struggle and self-doubt, the gradual rebuilding of confidence and capability, the woman who had been dismissed as too damaged for precision work had just accomplished something that would be talked about in shooting circles for decades to come. The trembling hands that had been mocked and written off had guided a bullet with precision measured in fractions of millimeters. Elena Vasquez had split a bullet on a razor blade at 200 yards, and in doing so, she had split open every assumption about limitation, disability, and the power of human determination. The media frenzy that followed Elena's impossible shot was unlike anything the competitive shooting world had ever witnessed. Within hours, videos of her razor split had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms, with shooting experts, military veterans, and sports commentators struggling to find adequate words for what they'd witnessed. Elena found herself seated at a hastily arranged press conference, still wearing her shooting jacket and trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Reporters from major news networks, sporting publications, and veteran advocacy organizations filled the conference room at Precision Point, their cameras and recording equipment focused on the woman who had just redefined the limits of human marksmanship. "Elena, can you walk us through what you were thinking during those final moments before the shot?" asked a reporter from Sports Illustrated. Elena looked out at the sea of faces, many of them showing the same expression of disbelief she'd been seeing all afternoon. "Honestly, I wasn't thinking about the impossibility of what I was attempting. I was just focusing on the fundamentals that Marcus Sergeant Chun had drilled into me during training. Breathing, trigger control, reading environmental conditions. The same techniques I learned in the military." "Speaking of your military background," another reporter interjected, "can you tell us about the injury that led to your medical discharge and how you overcame the hand tremors that ended your service?" Elena paused, considering how much of her story to share with this audience. The tremor in her hands was still visible as she held the microphone, a constant reminder of the neurological damage that had changed her life 3 years ago. "I was injured in an IED explosion in Afghanistan," she began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the subject. "The blast caused traumatic brain injury that affected the motor control in my hands. The Military Medical Board determined that the tremors made me unsuitable for combat operations, and I was medically discharged." She looked directly into the cameras, knowing that her words would reach thousands of veterans dealing with similar challenges. "For 3 years, I believed what everyone told me, that my shaky hands meant I couldn't shoot competitively anymore, that the explosion had taken away something fundamental about who I was." "What changed?" asked a reporter from the Army Times. "I had people who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself," Elena replied, glancing toward Marcus, who stood at the back of the room. My former instructor, Marcus Chen, taught me that tremors don't negate training. A gunsmith named Davidson saw potential when others saw only limitation. And I realized that perfect steadiness isn't the same thing as perfect shooting. James. Morrison stepped to the microphone, carrying an oversized check made out to Elena for $50,000. The prize money represented more than she'd earned in the past 2 years combined, but Elena knew the real value of her achievement. Went far beyond financial compensation. Elena, on behalf of Precision Point and our sponsors, it's my honor to present you with the championship prize, Morrison announced. But I think everyone here would agree that what you accomplished today transcends any monetary award. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, filled with the kind of respect that Elena had stopped believing she would ever receive again. As she accepted the check, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the explosion that had nearly destroyed her, the years of self-doubt and public humiliation, the gradual rebuilding of confidence and capability. "Elena," called out a reporter from CNN, "what would you say to other veterans who are struggling with injuries that have ended their military careers?" Elena stood quietly for a moment, choosing her words carefully. This was the question that mattered most, the opportunity to speak to people who understood the unique challenges of transitioning from military service to civilian life while dealing with physical or psychological injuries. "I'd tell them that their worst day doesn't define their future," she said finally. "I spent 3 years believing that the explosion had taken away everything that mattered about who I was. I let other people's limitations become my own limitations." She paused, looking down at her hands that still showed the familiar tremor. "The truth is, I'm still the same person who was injured 3 years ago. My hands still shake, my neurological damage hasn't been cured, and I still have days when the simplest tasks feel overwhelming. But I learned that adapting isn't the same thing as giving up." Davidson appeared beside the podium, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Elena recognized the careful way he handled the package, like someone transporting a precision instrument. "Elena, I have something that belongs to you," he said, unwrapping what appeared to be the 2 halves of her bullet, mounted in a custom display case. The projectile had been split so perfectly that the 2 pieces fit together seamlessly, creating a visual representation of precision that defied easy comprehension. This bullet traveled 200 yards and struck a target measuring 4/1000ths of an inch, Davidson announced to the assembled reporters. The precision required for that shot exists at the absolute limit of what's mechanically possible with conventional firearms. It represents not just exceptional marksmanship, but the convergence of perfect technique, ideal environmental conditions, and what I can only describe as an act of will. Elena accepted the display case, staring at the split bullet that would serve as a permanent reminder of what she'd accomplished. The metal fragments caught the light from the camera flashes, creating tiny sparks that seemed to dance across their surface. "There's something else you should know about Elena's achievement," Marcus said, stepping forward to address the press conference. "The shot she made today wasn't just technically perfect. It was made under pressure that would have broken most people. She didn't just hit an impossible target. She did it while carrying the weight of everyone's expectations and 3 years of being told she wasn't good enough." A reporter from Fox Sports raised her hand. "Elena, what's next for you? Will you be entering other competitions?" Elena smiled, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced since before her injury. "I've been offered a position as an instructor at the Advanced Marksmanship Academy," she said. "I'll be teaching precision shooting techniques with special focus on helping students overcome physical and psychological challenges." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The woman who had been deemed unsuitable for military marksmanship would now be training the next generation of precision shooters, passing on techniques that had enabled her to accomplish something that experts had called impossible. I want to teach students that perfection isn't about having perfect conditions, Elena continued. It's about being able to perform when everything is imperfect, when your hands shake, when the pressure is overwhelming, when everyone expects you to fail. That's when you discover what you're really capable of. As the press conference concluded and reporters began filing their stories about the veteran who had redefined the limits of human marksmanship, Elena realized that her journey was just beginning. The explosion that had nearly ended her story had instead become the opening chapter of something entirely new. The woman who had been broken was now helping others rebuild. The hands that had been called too shaky for precision work had just accomplished the most precise shot in competitive shooting history. And the veteran who had been written off as damaged goods was about to become one of the most sought-after instructors in the shooting world. Elena Vasquez had split a bullet on a razor blade, but more importantly, she had split the difference between what others believed was possible and what she proved could be achieved through determination, proper training, and refusing to accept other people's limitations as her own. 6 months after the razor split challenge, Elena stood before a classroom of advanced marksmanship students at the newly renamed Vasquez Precision Academy. The facility had been expanded significantly since her historic shot, with additional ranges, state-of-the-art training equipment, and a staff of instructors who specialized in working with students facing various physical and psychological challenges. The academy's walls were decorated with photographs and articles documenting Elena's achievement. But the centerpiece was a large display case containing the split bullet, the two perfect halves that served as a constant reminder of what could be accomplished when determination met proper training. Her current class included 12 students, representing diverse backgrounds and challenges. There was Michael, a young veteran who'd lost 3 fingers on his shooting hand in an IED explosion similar to Elena's. Sarah, a civilian shooter with mild cerebral palsy who'd been told by multiple instructors that her condition made precision shooting impossible. Robert, a former police officer dealing with PTSD who experienced severe anxiety attacks during competitive shooting. Today we're going to talk about the difference between limitation and adaptation. Elena began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd proven that conventional wisdom wasn't always correct. I want everyone to understand something fundamental. Your challenges don't define your capabilities. They simply change how you approach developing those capabilities. Elena walked to the front of the classroom, noting how several students instinctively watched her hands for signs of the tremor that had become part of her public story. She held up her hands deliberately, letting them see the slight but persistent shaking that still affected her fine motor control. These hands split a bullet on a razor blade at 200 yards, she said matter-of-factly. Not despite the tremor, but by learning to work with it. Michael, show everyone your shooting hand. The young veteran hesitantly displayed his reconstructed hand with its missing fingers and visible scarring from multiple surgical procedures. Other students in the class shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond to such an obvious physical challenge. Michael's been told by 3 different instructors that he can't achieve precision shooting with that hand, Elena continued. Last week, he fired a 5-shot group measuring 1.2 inches at 100 yards. That's better than most people with all their fingers intact. She moved to a whiteboard and began sketching a simple diagram showing different shooting positions and grip modifications. Adaptation isn't about overcoming your limitations. It's about finding new ways to achieve the same results. The fundamentals of marksmanship remain the same regardless of your physical condition. Elena's teaching methodology had evolved from her own experience of rebuilding her shooting skills after injury, rather than focusing on traditional techniques that assumed perfect physical capability. She taught students to analyze their individual challenges and develop personalized approaches that worked within their specific constraints. Sarah, come up here and show the class your shooting stance, Elena instructed. Sarah approached the front of the room with the careful movements of someone whose muscle control required constant attention. Her cerebral palsy affected her balance and fine motor skills, but weeks of training with Elena had taught her to use those challenges as part of her shooting process rather than obstacles to overcome. Watch how Sarah's stance is wider than conventional teaching suggests, Elena explained as Sarah demonstrated her modified position. The textbooks say this is wrong, but for Sarah's specific needs, it provides the stability foundation she requires for consistent shot placement. Elena had discovered that many students with physical challenges actually developed superior marksmanship fundamentals because they couldn't rely on natural ability or physical advantages. They were forced to understand the science behind accurate shooting in ways that physically gifted shooters often ignored. The Academy's reputation had grown rapidly as word spread about Elena's innovative teaching methods and the exceptional results achieved by students who'd been written off by traditional instructors. Veterans with combat injuries, civilian shooters with disabilities, and even law enforcement officers dealing with age-related changes in their capabilities sought training at the facility. "Robert, I want you to tell the class about your first day here," Elena said, gesturing toward the former police officer who'd struggled with anxiety-induced performance issues. Robert stood slowly, his demeanor showing the confidence that had developed over months of specialized training. "When I first came here, I couldn't complete a shooting session without having a panic attack. Elena taught me that my anxiety wasn't a weakness. It was information I could use to improve my performance." Elena nodded approvingly. Robert learned to recognize the physical signs of anxiety and incorporate them into his pre-shot routine. Instead of fighting the adrenaline, he learned to channel it into heightened focus and awareness. The transformation of students like Robert represented what Elena considered her most important achievement, not the technical precision of splitting a bullet, but the human impact of helping people rediscover capabilities they believed were lost forever. During the break between classroom sessions and range practice, Elena found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed since that day at Precision Point. The prize money from the competition had provided financial stability, but the real reward had been the opportunity to build something meaningful from her experience. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus, who now served as the Academy's chief instructor for advanced tactical shooting. "New student incoming next week. Army sniper, bilateral amputation below the elbows. Doctors say precision shooting is impossible. Thought you should know." Elena smiled as she typed her response. "Send me his file. We'll figure it out." That afternoon, as Elena worked with her students on the range, she watched Michael achieve another personal best. His modified grip and shooting technique, producing groups that would have impressed instructors at any facility in the country. Sarah was consistently hitting targets at distances that her previous instructors had claimed were beyond her capabilities. Robert was shooting with the calm precision of someone who'd learned to make anxiety an ally rather than an enemy. "Elena, can I ask you something?" Michael approached as the session concluded. "Do you ever miss your old life? The military, I mean, before everything changed?" Elena considered the question as she watched her students pack their equipment, noting the confidence and determination that had replaced the doubt and frustration they'd shown when first arriving. "At the Academy, I used to think the explosion took away my future," she replied finally. "But I realize now that it just changed the direction. The person I was before could never have helped people the way I can now. My injury didn't end my story. It started a new chapter." As the students left for the day, Elena remained on the fuzz range, running her fingers along the split bullet display that had become the Academy's symbol. The two perfect halves represented more than just exceptional marksmanship. They symbolized the possibility of transformation, the power of refusing to accept limitations, and the truth that sometimes what appears to be an ending is actually A beginning. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that human potential couldn't be measured by conventional standards. Elena Vasquez had learned that the most precise shots were always taken with the steadiest hands, but with the most determined hearts. The woman who had been mocked for her shaky hands was now teaching others that greatness could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, and that the difference between limitation and possibility was often just a matter of perspective and proper training. 2 years after the Razor Split Challenge, Elena Vasquez stood on the podium at the National Veterans Affairs Conference, addressing an audience of over 3,000 veterans, medical professionals, and advocates. The conference had invited her to deliver the keynote speech about overcoming disability and finding new purpose after military service. But Elena knew her real message went far beyond her personal story. When I was medically discharged from the Army 3 years ago, I believed my identity had been taken from me, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the convention center sound system. I had defined myself entirely by my military capabilities, and when those capabilities were challenged by injury, I felt like I had nothing left to offer. In the audience, Elena could see faces that reflected her own journey, veterans dealing with physical injuries, psychological trauma, and the difficult transition from military service to civilian life. Some sat in wheelchairs, others showed visible signs of combat wounds, and many carried invisible burdens that were no less real for being unseen. I spent 3 years believing that my trembling hands represented failure. Elena continued, holding up her hands so the audience could see the slight but persistent shaking that still affected her. 3 years accepting other people's assessment that I was broken, damaged, unsuitable for the things that had once defined my purpose. Behind Elena, a large screen displayed a slow-motion video of her historic shot, the bullet traveling toward the razor blade and splitting with mathematical precision. The footage had been viewed millions of times since the competition, becoming a symbol of human potential that transcended the shooting sports community. But I learned something important during my journey back to competitive shooting, Elena said as the video played. Our limitations don't define us, our response to those limitations does. The shot you're watching wasn't made despite my condition. It was made because I learned to work with my condition, to adapt my technique, and to refuse to accept other people's definitions of what was possible. Elena's academy had expanded significantly since her championship victory, with satellite locations in 3 states and a waiting list of students that stretched for months. Her teaching methodology had been studied by sports psychologists, adopted by other instructors, and incorporated into veterans' rehabilitation programs across the country. Today, I want to talk about the difference between recovery and adaptation. Elena continued. Recovery implies returning to what you were before. Adaptation means becoming something new, something that might actually be better than what you were before. She gestured toward the audience, many of whom had traveled hundreds of miles to hear her speak. Every person in this room has capabilities that haven't been fully explored. Every challenge you face is also an opportunity to discover strengths you didn't know you possessed. Elena walked across the stage, her movement showing the confidence that had replaced the self-doubt she'd carried for years after her injury. I run a shooting academy now that specializes in working with people who've been told they can't achieve precision marksmanship. Students with missing limbs, neurological conditions, PTSD, vision problems, conditions that traditional instruction considers disqualifying. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word as Elena shared examples of students who had exceeded every expectation through adaptive training techniques and refusal to accept conventional limitations. Last month, a student with no arms below the elbows fired a group measuring less than 2 inches at 100 yards, using a specially designed shooting system, Elena announced. Another student, legally blind in one eye with limited vision in the other, consistently hits targets that sighted shooters struggle with. These aren't feel-good stories about people overcoming disability. These are examples of human potential being expressed through different methods. Elena's message had evolved beyond shooting sports to encompass broader themes of resilience, adaptation, and the danger of allowing others to define what was possible for your life. Veterans organizations had begun incorporating her philosophy into rehabilitation programs, and her academy's techniques were being studied by medical professionals working with trauma survivors. "I want to leave you with something that took me years to understand," Elena said as her speech drew toward its conclusion. "The explosion that injured me wasn't the end of my story as a marksman. It was the beginning of my story as someone who could help others discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed." She paused, looking out at faces that showed recognition, hope, and determination. Your worst day doesn't define your future. Your injury doesn't represent the limits of your potential. Your diagnosis doesn't determine what you can achieve. Those things change how you approach your goals, but they don't change your fundamental ability to achieve them. Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out the split bullet that had become her constant companion, the two perfect halves that served as a reminder of what could be accomplished when determination met proper preparation. "This bullet represents something important," she said, holding the display case up for the audience to see. "It shows what happens when you refuse to accept other people's assessment of what's impossible. When you combine proper training with absolute determination, you can achieve things that experts say can't be done." The standing ovation that followed was sustained and emotional, filled with the kind of recognition that comes from shared experience and mutual understanding. Elena had become more than a successful shooter. She had become a symbol of possibility for anyone who had been written off, dismissed, or told they were no longer capable of excellence. After the conference, Elena found herself surrounded by veterans eager to share their own stories and ask for advice about overcoming their specific challenges. Each conversation reinforced her understanding that the razor split challenge had been just the beginning of her real mission. A young Marine approached, his sleeve pinned up where his right arm had been amputated below the shoulder. "Ma'am, I was a sniper before my injury. Then told I can't shoot competitively anymore. Is that true?" Elena smiled, remembering her own journey from despair to discovery. "That depends on whether you're willing to learn new techniques and refuse to accept other people's limitations as your own. Are you interested in finding out what you're really capable of?" As the conference concluded and Elena prepared to return to her academy, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that day when Tommy Rodriguez had mocked her shaky hands at precision point. The woman who had been dismissed as damaged goods was now one of the most respected voices in adaptive athletics, and her techniques were helping people around the world discover capabilities they'd thought were lost forever. Elena Vasquez had split a bullet on a razor blade, but her true achievement was splitting the difference between what society said was possible and what human determination could actually accomplish. She had proven that sometimes the most unlikely people were capable of the most extraordinary things, and that the limitations others placed on them were often far more restrictive than the challenges they actually faced. The trembling hands that had once been a source of shame had become instruments of precision that helped others understand that greatness could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. Elena's legacy wasn't just the impossible shot she'd made, but the impossible dreams she'd helped others achieve by teaching them that adaptation was often stronger than perfection, and that the most precise aim came not from steady hands, but from a steady heart that refused to give up. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.